Hello, and welcome back to our next computer side chat, where we're going to begin our next unit. So to this point, we have talked about the basics of government, and we've talked about government in a real general sense. Now we want to move on to looking at the American part of this American government class, and we want to start examining where these ideas came from. Our government, as it currently is structured, the ideas that came from the framers or founders, as we often talk or refer to them as, those ideas weren't born in a vacuum. In other words, they just didn't come up with those ideas out of nowhere. There were influences and legacies that they referred to get those ideas and to base this government on. And so we want to look now then at those early ideas. And to do that, we've got to look back at when America was still just a group of colonies. And how did they govern themselves? And what were some of the prevailing principles or ideas that drove government in colonial America? So let's go ahead and get into that right now. So again, we're going to be looking at principles of American government. And our essential question here is going to be, why were the American colonies founded? And what ideas or principles were early colonial governments based on? Now, this idea of America originating as 13 colonies is not new to you. In other words, you've been learning about this since like first grade. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but I do think it's worth revisiting to make sure we're all on the same page and we're all good to go. In other words, the United States originated as 13 American colonies located in the east of what is a modern-day United States. Those colonies were founded or established in 1607, and they were founded by the British Empire. Now, why did the British decide to create these colonies all the way on the other side of the Atlantic? Well, it's the same reason why any major empire was creating colonies and why there was such a aggressive race between countries like Britain and Spain and France to colonize the Americas. And the simple explanation is money. If you look at this map in the middle of this slide, you can see kind of the relationship of trade between the colonies and Europe. And this red arrow in particular that runs from the colonies over to Great Britain, you can see some of the goods that came from the American colonies. Things like furs and iron and indigo and tobacco. All of these things were luxury goods that sold for a very hefty profit, not just in Britain, but in all of Europe. And so the British government stood to make a lot of money by creating these colonies within the Americas. Now, these colonies had their own governments. Each colony was a little bit different. That said, it would take a lot of time for us to go through all 13 colonies, try to memorize the differences in governments between all of them. So we're going to focus more on big picture ideas. In other words, what are some of kind of the prevailing ideas or principles that all of them endorse to some extent? So we're going to focus on 5 in particular. And within some of those 5 are going to be some sub-ideas or sub-principles that it's important to bring up along with them because they're terms or concepts. They're going to come up a lot for us throughout this class. So let's go ahead and get into our first. So our first principle is going to be limited government. And limited government is simply the idea that government power is not absolute. That just means that government cannot do whatever it wants. There are certain restrictions placed on government. Government cannot do certain things. In modern day sense, you might think of that as our freedom of speech. In other words, government is limited from infringing upon your freedom to say whatever you want. Now, there's some scenarios that are an exception to that freedom, but for the most part, 99% of what you do or say, the government cannot punish you for that. This idea was also present in the colonies, and in fact, it originated at the very, very start. In other words, if we look at this picture on the left, that is the signing of a document called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower is, again, something that you probably heard of dating back to elementary school. This was, of course, the ship that brought the first pilgrims over and landed at Plymouth Rock. Well, when those pilgrims landed, they decided that they needed some kind of agreement between all the people that would land there. And so they signed this compact, which basically said how they would govern themselves. And more explicitly, it said what that government could do, but also what it could not do, and what rights were protected by the people. Our second principle is representative government. And representative government simply means that citizens elect officials who make laws and government decisions on their behalf. In other words, citizens vote. Those votes elect people to office, and those people in office do the daily job of government or governing. So they make the laws, they make the decisions, they talk to other people within the government or other important outside entities and make decisions on behalf of the people. And again, this is a concept that we see very early on that first emerges in Virginia. So if you look in the middle, this building here is in Williamsburg, Virginia. And it's known as the Virginia House of Burgesses. It was founded in 1619, and it is the first elected legislative body in all of the colonies. So Virginia was the first place that allowed its citizens to elect members to a legislative body that would make laws for them. This quickly spread throughout the rest of the colonies, and certainly long before 1776, all 13 colonies had some kind of elected officials within their borders. Now, this representative government relies on a concept that we've already hit on in some sense, but we haven't necessarily used this term yet, and that is popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty simply means that government power is derived from the people. In other words, government power comes from the people. Government has its power because the people have agreed to give them that power. So in other words, an official is elected, that grants them certain powers. They're voted out of office, that means the people took those powers away from them. So this idea of popular sovereignty is really important to the idea of representative government. It means that government only exists because of the will of the people. Third is the protection of natural rights. And once again, this should be familiar to you. This is something we talked about quite a bit in our previous unit. If you look off to the left here, you'll see John Locke, an individual that we talked about quite a bit when we focused on the social contract. And if you remember, one of Locke's big things was that everyone has these natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and that those rights have to be protected. And so that's what we mean by protection of natural rights. All we're saying with this principle is that all people have this right of a life, liberty, and property. And it's the job of the government to make sure that those rights are not infringed upon. So again, we're seeing this taken directly from Locke, an individual that was alive before the colonies were even founded. Now, it's important to understand that that life and liberty and property that you have, you can give up your right to that. And you would do that by, say, infringing upon someone else's right to life, liberty, or property. So let's say you commit the crime of murder against someone else. Well, then the government is going to possibly take away your right to life, either through imprisonment or possibly even execution. But government cannot do that unless it first gives you the ability to go through what is called due process. And this is a term that you are going to see a ton. It's really important that you understand it. It simply means the government cannot take away your life, liberty, or property unless they first give you a chance to defend yourself in court. So this goes back to that idea that you probably heard of you are not innocent, or excuse me, you are innocent until proven guilty. You have the right to go in front of a jury of your peers in a courtroom, defend yourself, and if you're found innocent, you have the right to go free of the accusations that have been made against you. So that's this idea of due process. Those rights cannot be taken away from you unless you get this trial and then it is proven that you are guilty in that trial. Fourth, we have separation of powers. Again, a term that you have probably heard since either middle or elementary school. Separation of powers simply means that government power will be divided into three independent branches, usually denoted as legislative, executive, and judicial. Each of these branches have their own unique powers with which they can carry out those powers without having to worry about being interfered on by the other branches. Now, it's important to understand that as those branches carry out their job, there are certain places along the way where those other branches can step in and keep them from abusing their power. And this is known as checks and balances. In other words, each branch has a way that it can check the power or decisions of other branches. So, in other words, the legislative body has the ability to pass laws. And the Supreme Court can't just come in and try to influence legislators as they pass those laws. Congress is free to do that on their own. But after Congress passes a law, the Supreme Court could make a determination that that law is unconstitutional, that it violates the U.S. Constitution. So that would be an example of the judicial branch checking the legislative branch. And again, we see this present in the colonies. We see, as I've already talked about, these elected legislative bodies who served underneath a governor. That governor was appointed by the king. So in other words, that governor was not directly answerable to the people of their colony. But the salary of those governors was set by the colonial legislatures. And so in that way, the legislative branches of these individual colonies could act as a check on the governors or the executive branch within each colony. They could, if the governor decided to abuse their power, threaten to cut his salary as punishment for that. And so that acted as a check on these governors. All right, last one, written constitution. A written constitution is simply a blueprint or framework for how government will be structured and what it can or cannot do. In other words, it lays out in explicit details how a government will work. Today, our government is structured by the U.S. Constitution, which you can see off to the left here. It begins with "we the people" and then goes step by step, laying out what is the role and duties and powers of each branch of the government and the federal government as a whole. This idea of written constitutions, once again, dates back long before we were an independent country and long before we were 13 colonies. We can go back to 1215 and look at the Magna Carta, which was the first written constitution in England, and look at that as a really early influence on American ideas of written constitutions. And in fact, we will look at that. We can also see that each individual colony had what was called a charter, which was a form of constitution. In other words, these charters simply stated that these colonies were legal entities that would be governed by a royal governor, but would also have elected legislative bodies. And would go on to say more about what the government would look like, but these charters acted as early versions of written constitutions within each individual colony. Now, why do we need that? Why do we need to write down exactly what our government can do and what it cannot do? Well, it's really important to make sure that we maintain what is known as the rule of law. And the rule of law simply means that government is based on clear and fairly enforced laws, and that no one, whether citizen or government official, is above those laws. What that means is that you need to have these things written down, whether that's a law or a constitution or whatever it may be, so that we can go and we can reference those things. If you let government officials just make things up on the fly, then that means they will be able to get away with whatever they want. By having things written down and clear statements on what is allowed and not allowed, you ensure that the rule of law is upheld. The government cannot abuse its power, that individual citizens cannot abuse their fellow citizens, and if an abuse is carried out, there is a source to point to that you can say, hey, here's a specific reason why the thing that you did is not legal, and therefore you are open to punishment for that thing. So the rule of law is why it's important to have a written constitution of some kind. So that wraps up our look at some of the basic principles of early American government that would go on to help guide our ideas of government when we would become an independent country. From here, you're going to want to write your summary as always, and then make sure that your notes look good, nothing you need to go back and look at again, and just make sure that you're ready for our quiz tomorrow. Once we take that quiz, we'll talk about things a little bit, and then dive into where these ideas came from, who influenced these early colonial leaders to go with these ideas of government. We've already looked at Locke and Hobbes, but let's look at some of the other people that drove these ideas and made it so that all 13 colonies, while they were different in some ways, had a lot of similarities, as we can see with these principles. So look forward to getting to that. Have a good one. We'll see you then.